This tutorial covers the branches of government. Government is divided into a series of different institutions that have different tasks, really. And I'm going to identify the four main branches of government and explain the distinctive roles of each of these in a democratic system. So, institutions of government then, these are the institutions and people that carry out the affairs and administration of a political system. Each branch has a different role, and not every branch has the same sort of responsibilities or powers, but they all interrelate and have to act in relation to each other in some fashion. These are the branches: the executive, the bureaucracy, the legislature, and the judiciary. So starting with the executive, the part of government that initiates policies, sets agendas, carries out the business of government, and represents the country. It supervises all sort of government, state activities, if you will, and the executive includes the head of government and the head of state. These are not the same thing. The head of government is responsible for the administration of government. In Canada, where I live, that is the Prime Minister. Same thing in the UK. The head of state represents the state. In Canada, this is the monarch, the Queen of Canada, which is represented by the Governor General. So the Crown is the head of state, and the Prime Minister is the head of government. In some countries, these functions are in the same office. So, for instance, the President of the United States is both the head of state and the head of government. So this division of functionalities will be confusing to Americans, who might not be able to distinguish the function between the Prime Minister of Canada and the Queen of Canada, in that sense, or of Britain, and so on. Most countries divide the head of government, and most democratic countries divide the head of government from the head of state. The bureaucracy is the part of government that administers policy. This is where the bureaucrats are, the civil servants. They carry out the wishes of the government. So when cabinet has decided something, someone has to do it, and that's where the bureaucracy comes in. It has sometimes been described in a somewhat negative light. There are plenty of stereotypes and caricatures of how the bureaucracy can work, including the word red tape, for instance. Its function is to implement the decisions, and public employees are also often called civil servants because they serve the civic body, if you will. And it's often our first and sometimes our only interaction with government. Most of us don't get to talk directly to a president or prime minister or a minister, but many of us will talk to a clerk in a registry office, or maybe if we lose our job, we go to an employment office, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of places we will talk to civil servants, including police officers and so on. Now, top civil servants often have a lot of power and influence, and there's a whole branch of political science just looking at that. The legislature is the place where laws are being made. So the executive can propose laws, but it is the legislature that decides on laws. Now, this was originally intended to reduce the amount of power given to rulers. Again, the executive. See Magna Carta in the United Kingdom, which was the first time in Western Europe when a king had his power checked by the nobility. So parliaments then grew out of this, in a sense, and as an institutional check on power. So governments needed to get assent from the legislature for their bills to be passed into law. And the limits of power here is dictated by the rule of law, convention, and practices. So what the parliament, the legislature, can do, it's going to be varying slightly from country to country in how they pass laws and so on and so forth. And I'm talking again about democratic countries. One important principle here is that legislatures cannot make decisions that bind future legislatures from reversing those decisions. And that's important so that we have political options. If a left-wing government makes a decision, then a later right-wing government can undo those decisions. That's part of the process. And of course, the one exception to this would be the Constitution, which is harder to change, but still possible to change. So there we go. So functions here include lawmaking, debate and accountability, question period, for instance, in countries that have that, budgeting for government, and representation. So the act of standing for the views of others. Now, we elect as voters, we elect representatives to Parliament, to the Legislature, and these members of the Legislature symbolize the collective view of all the constituents. Typically, in most democracies, there are either bicameral or unicameral parliaments, legislatures. They can have the powers in one house or divided by two chambers. So there are legislatures, parliamentary bodies with two assemblies. Canada, the US, for instance, have two parts of the legislature. In the US, you have the House of Representatives and the Senate. In Canada, you have the House of Commons and the Senate. In the UK, you have the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and so on. There are also countries which do not have two chambers, they have only one. So parliamentary bodies with one assembly. Sweden would be one such case. You'll find more of those countries in Europe. And then we have the judiciary, which has three main functions: adjudicates disputes, resolves conflicts through the courts, interprets laws, and in some cases, in some countries, you have something called judicial review. So the laws then are the rules that the governing authority impose on society. Judicial review means judging the constitutionality of laws. So if the legislature tries to pass a law that violates the Constitution, that goes against the Constitution, then the Supreme Court of the land can say, no, this doesn't work. It goes against the Constitution. So this law either is struck down, it's invalid, or it can't be created. And that is an important function in some countries. The United States, for instance, this is why the Supreme Court is so important. A country like Sweden doesn't really have judicial review. Formally, if you look at the Sweden's basic law, you're not supposed to be able to create an unconstitutional law, but the wording and the institutions in Sweden means that no one is going to find any law unconstitutional. So government there's not much of a judiciary check on parliament in that country. We can talk about two primary types of laws: common law and civil law. Common law being decisions that are made on the basis of precedent and case laws derived from customs, very common in Anglo-Saxon countries. Civil law, which is where the legislative bodies enact laws through statutes, ordinances, and regulations, and this is derived from the text of the law as written, more common in France and the countries that have adopted that legal tradition. And that is an overview of the branches of government. The executive decides what the government should do. The legislature approves government suggestions and creates laws. The judiciary is an arbiter of government actions. And the bureaucracy implements government policy initiatives.